while I'm pretty happy with the way that the feather wraps around the rock, we do not meet the hypothesis stated by Galileo that two objects will fall at the exact same speed regardless of the mass. And as we can see in the cloth up here in soft feather, there is no parameter for air resistance. So how would we get the effect of the feather with the rigid body, that it's falling a lot slower along with the cloth? We probably need some sort of indicator that will show us that at this point behave like a cloth, and before that behave like a rigid body. In fact, in my case, I'd like to swap out one game object for another. I'd like the feather to start out as a rigid body and end as a cloth as it nears the rock. And this is where triggers come in. To create a trigger, you start out the same. You create an object or you add a collider onto it. I usually just create a cube, then I manipulate it. Let's position it to about the height of the rock, of where we expect it to fall. A little higher. I'm just going to move this up like that, and let's give it a little bit more padding on the sides. Okay, now we do not need a mesh filter, don't need a mesh renderer. We just need the collider. And in fact, this collider is not going to behave like a collider. It's going to be a trigger. And what that is that we can script the behavior of an object when it comes in the territory of the trigger. And in this case, we're just substituting one game object for another, but in your game, this might be useful to, for example, to create checkpoints of some sort, or maybe to create a cutscene as your character approaches some sort of zone, to create explosions. Well, you can use your imagination to go further, but in this case we're going to demonstrate this with a game object swap, a swap for a rigid body game object to a cloth. Now, the thing with cloth is that because all of the vertices are being manipulated by the cloth solver, there is no direct way to move the transform. All of the vertices are moving more or less independently. And this means that the cloth cannot be manipulated by a transform. To manipulate this object is usually done by either disabling these components or just disabling the game object overall. Before I get into scripting this swap and its effect by the collider, I'm going to create a game object that's going to manage both of these feathers. Now the game object itself is actually going to have the rigid body. The rigid body feather will just be a renderer. So to do so, because I want the same positioning as the transform and I want the exact same shape as this rigid body, I'm going to duplicate the hard feather by pressing Command D, Control D for those on Windows. I'm going to rename this Manager Feathers. Now I'm going to remove all of the visual components and keep the rigid body. And on the actual feather, we're going to do the exact opposite. Just remove the collider and the rigid body. So what's going to happen is that the physics will be calculated from this manager, and the feathers will then be managed by this empty game object with a rigid body and a collider. So I'm going to just parent both of these feathers underneath. And let's get into the code. I'm going to create a code directory. And within the directory, I'm going to click on the Create button and create a new C# script. I'm going to call this Feather Manager. Just double click on the file and it will open up MonoDevelop. Okay, and I'm just going to delete both of the start and the update functions. We're going to write our own. So first we're going to we need to address both of the hard and the soft feathers. So to do so, we create a couple reference variables. Going to need to make them public so I can address them in the inspector, public. And I'm going to address them as a game object. And then I'm going to reference them as hard feather. Create another game object. And I'm going to call this soft feather. Okay, I'm going to create a start function. And in the beginning, even though I had the feather turned off, just to make sure that it is going to be turned off, I'm going to turn it off anyway. So soft feather dot set active, which is going to be a way to enable or disable the game object. And this is a function. So as the parameter, I'm going to specify a Boolean value of false. Okay, that's all we need to do in the start function. Now we're going to create a function to swap the rigid body to a soft body, to cloth. And this will need to be a public function because, well, you'll see in a moment. We'll need to address this from the collider. Public void swap rigid to soft. Or actually, we're using the word hard. We can stick to the convention. Swap hard to soft. Okay, and we need to turn on one of the functions within rigid bodies, and that's to make them kinematic. And kinematic means that the body will only be moved by transform. It will be an active rigid body, so meaning it's not just a collider, but it can be manipulated by transform instead of just being affected by the world or falling down within gravity. So to do so, I'm going to address this game object itself, so neither the hard feather or the soft feather, because if you remember, the hard feather actually does not have a rigid body attached. I removed it along with the collider, and now both of them are residing on the manager itself. So we're going to be putting the script on the manager. We're going to need to address this game object. That rigid body, we're going to address the rigid body class, and then address the Boolean value of is kinematic to true. Going to create another command, and this time I'm going to disable the collider. Dot enabled false. Okay. Now we're going to address the hard feather and actually turn the renderer off, because otherwise I'll be seeing two feathers. So hard feather dot set active. So I'm just going to use this function to enable or disable the game object. I'm going to create false. We don't want to see the hard feather. And finally, we're going to address the soft feather and set it to true. Okay, so this is done. We are done with this script. However, this tells us nothing about how to behave with the collider. For this purpose, we're going to create a second script. Let's go back to Unity. I'm going to go into my code directory, and I'm going to create a second script. And this script is going to be on the collider, and it's going to tell our feather manager script to perform this command. So I'm going to call this zone swapper. Okay, it's going to be within the boundaries of this collider. Let's actually give it a good name while we're at it. The zone swap. I'm going to open up the script. We do not need either of these functions. And I'm going to create a specific function within Unity. And this function is going to be called onTrigger enter. The name has to be the exact same. You cannot name this function whatever you like. And this function expects a collider. It expects an object to enter it. Now, not only does it expect a collider, it expects a collider with a rigid body, or you can use a rigid body on the trigger. And remember, if you are going to use it and you don't want the object to move around, make sure to set it as kinematic. So we're going to set up a collider parameter. And now we might have several rigid bodies enter this space. They don't necessarily have to be the feather, or in your case, they might necessarily not be the hero. They might have some other objects. You might have some asteroids or rocks falling down on that area, and you don't want this function triggered. We want to see, hey, is this the object that we're looking for? And we're going to check this by checking if this object has a script. So we're going to create a conditional statement. We're going to address this parameter, so collider dot game object dot get component feather manager, and we're going to check this. Is this not null? Okay, so it's going to say, hey, if you get the component and there's a feather manager, if this class is not there, that means you do not pass the rules of this conditional statement. If it is not null, then continue. And what we want to do now is launch this swap function. So we're going to address this again the exact same way. Collider game object that get component feather manager. Alternatively, we could cache this name, but in this case, just for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to address it twice. And now we need to pull out the function. So I just press dot, and I believe it's swap hard to soft. Okay, and that's it. That's all we need to do. So the way that this works is that it goes into the specific function on trigger enter. So when something enters the trigger of this collider that we put in, that's a trigger, it's going to check, hey, does this object have a feather manager script? And if it does have a script, if it's not null, then it goes, okay, so take this object and then launch the function swap hard to soft. Then it goes into this script, and then it disables the collider, it makes the rigid body kinematic, disables the hard feather, and enables the soft feather. Let's see it in action. We're getting no errors in the console. Now we need to apply the feather manager script onto the manager of feathers game object. And how do we find these objects? How does it know which one's the hard feather and the soft feather? We could do a search within the children of this object. I decided to simply address them here as reference variables. So you can either drag this in, or you can click on this circle thing here, scene, and then select the hard feather. And this one, just to be different, I'm going to drag in soft feather here. And now we need to drag in a script for the zone swapper into the zone swap. Just check to see if it's there. And that's all we need to do. I'm going to press Command P to play. Okay, there it goes. So there's the rigid body. And there it turns into the soft body. Cool, well, we got the effect we wanted. It's a little jerky. Let's see if we can make the collider a little taller. Zone swap. Okay, I'm just going to place it here. Now there is a function that will say on trigger exit, we can only have it on trigger enter, so technically if it falls up here, then we can switch it back to a rigid body if we want to. I do not have this function, so I could just simply move it up. Let's experiment further. So there's the rigid body, and then it becomes the soft body and falls down. Okay, and there is our feather.